Next, I want to take a look at the camera. So when the player is moving upwards, we want to move the camera along with the movement, along with the jump. And but what we want to do is we don't want the camera to follow the player when the player is moving downwards. And finally, if the player falls out of the view of the camera, then that's game over, right? So a few things we want to do with the camera. And let's start creating a state machine for the camera. And you'll understand a bit more once we go through this exercise. Right, so the first thing I want to do is I want to know if the player is moving up or down. Right, so if the player is moving downwards, then I don't want to move the camera. And if you're not too familiar with how doodle jump works, you can YouTube it or download it on the iPhone and see how the camera works in that game. But basically, when the player is jumping upwards, the camera will continue moving up along with the player. But let's say if you are here and then the player sort of falls off the screen, then that's game over. And the camera never moves down, right? So that's kind of the rule of the game. Okay, so let's see. The first thing I need to do is I need to find out if the player is moving up or down. So let's go to the action browser, go to physics, and then we're gonna get velocity. Right, so let's read the description here. Get the velocity of a game object and store it in variables, right? So the game object must have a rigid body, and that's what we have on the player object, so that's good. And you might see this warning, don't click on this because we're not getting velocity from the camera. We want to get the velocity from the player. So specify game object. Let's drag the player here. And then let's go to the variables panel, and we're just going to create player y velocity. So all we care about is the velocity on the y, so we're just going to assign the velocity to our variable here, and we want to do it every frame. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is I want to compare that float with the 0. Float compare. Right. So if that float is smaller than 0, then that means the object is moving downwards. If the float is bigger than 0, then that means the player object is moving upwards. So we're going to compare the y velocity with 0. And when it's greater than 0, we're going to go to a certain event. Make sure we're checking the every frame option here. The event would be, okay, we're moving up. We're moving up. Right, so I'm going to add that event. And that's going to be triggered when the velocity variable is greater than 0. And I'm going to change the state to state. And then add another state. Move. Right, so when the player is moving upwards, I'm going to go to the move state. And when the player is moving downwards, we're going to go back to the stay state, right? So which means there's no action here to move the camera. So before I do everything else, I'll just copy these, go to the move state and paste them. And what I want to do is just to create this loop first. And go to events, player moving down. And so when the y velocity is smaller than 0, we're going to go to the player moving down event. Player moving down and go back. Right. Okay, let's just see if that works first. See if we're detecting these movements correctly. Okay, here we go. So you can see that when the player is moving upwards, it goes to this state, and it's going downwards, it's moving back to this state. So that's working, that's good. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is when the camera is in this move state, we want to make sure that it's moving to the highest Y position. So it should compare itself. If its Y position is larger than the player Y position, if it's not, then we'll set the new position as the player Y position. And if the camera is already larger, the camera Y position is already higher than the player, then we don't move the camera. So let's do that quickly. Well, first of all, we need to get the positions, right? So we need to get the player Y position, and then also self Y position, right? The position of the camera. And go to Action Browser, get position. Now we need to do this first before we consider the move, just because we wanted to start moving, or start looking at potentially moving as early as possible when we move into the state. So I am going to grab the player object and store that Y position in player Y position. Do it every frame. And then again, get position. I'm going to get the, let's see, user owner self Y position every frame. Okay, so now we get the position of the camera and the player. Okay, that's good. And I want to figure out which one is bigger, right? And then I'm going to take that bigger number and apply it to the camera Y position. That's how we're going to move the Y axis on the camera. So in order to make this a little bit more clear, I'm going to create a new variable. This is going to be new Y position. Okay. And I'm going to go to float. I'm going to go to math again. So this is where we need to find out which one of these two positions are bigger, right? So we're going to go float operator. And I want to make sure that we do that after the positions were required. Okay. And we're going to say, okay, we're going to put player Y position here and self Y position here. And the operation will be max, right? So we want to pick the bigger one among the two, and we want to store it in new Y position. Make sure we do that every frame. And finally, we want to set position. Again, make sure we do things in the right order. And we're just going to set our position to the new Y position. Again, every frame, dealing with the world position. So I think this will allow us to move okay, let's go through this again. When the game starts, we detect if the player is going upwards or not. And if it's going upwards, go to the move state, and what we want to do is we want to pick the bigger of the two among the player Y position or the camera Y position. And then we're going to set the new camera position to the larger of the two. And once we start detecting that the player is going downwards, we're going to go back to this stay state and then just stop moving the camera. Okay, so let's give that a try. Okay, so you can see that the camera is moving whenever the player object is above sort of the middle point of the screen. Again, it's moving, and it doesn't follow the camera. The camera doesn't follow the player if it's going downwards. Okay, so that's the effect we want. Very good.